you
his
still cooking?
biased earnings, and I gotta take a fucking fat shit.
Yo, who's debating, bro?
Yo, Nani, like, why are you always shitting, bro?
What can I say?
Might as well gassy.
Nani's like, you're like the gassy invincible meme, bro. Yes, sir.
You mean Incredibles?
Oh, yeah, incredible. Wait, what's like that one nigga that like died to
Don't say it.
the?
Don't say it, bro. Not right now.
we can go over it like after the debate, bro.
That guy was caught off guard, very obviously.
I mean, that's like a massive like off guard drop in durability, bro.
Well, no, his durability was asked to begin with.
Bro, you're gonna like ping, bro? Like they finna listen to us, yeah.
I'm waiting for Oshi to tell me when the recording starts.
The recording already started.
Oh,
Nigga,
okay.
is that the OBS recording or is that the power recording?
So I'll just give my introductions. Are you fine today, Infinity?
Yep.
Okay, got you. So for the recording, me and Infinity will be debating again on the same topic on God's existence. I'll be defending the same position, and Infinity will be basically agnostic on the proposition again. But that being said, he'll be placing into question what the argument is and the credibility of the argument is concerned. And so we're just going to ask Infinity over here if he's willing to add anything else to the introduction. So, and if not, we can just head right into the conversation, basically.
Yeah, look, so I'm just assuming the clarity is going to be the same. Can you please mute Z-Killer, by the way, because he does have the green activity showing, although I'm not sure that he's speaking. Now, look, the clarity is going to be the following, at least as questions. 1, what do you mean to say whenever you talk about God's existence? 2, what mode of existence specifically are you referring to? And then finally speaking, I'm assuming you're going to be using the same analyticity regarding his existence within the external world? Am I right in the last point?
Sorry for the long delay, but just to respond to the first two questions before I answer the third question, of course, what I mean by God primarily is just an independent being, a being which is independent of all things, an omnipotent creator which has maximal causal power. So that's going to be the definition of what God is for the conversation primarily. As for the mode of existence, as I've clarified in the previous debate on numerous different occasions, and I'll do this again for this conversation, the mode of existence is going to be an external world existence.
And then the answer to the final question, which I'm not sure if you...
Oh yeah, the third question also, because I had to basically just be my mic for a second. So the third question as it pertains to whether I'm going to be appealing to the analyticity point as a means of justifying the point that I was making previously, the answer is yes. That's basically the fundamental motivation behind some of the premises within the argument. So what other objections do you have to the argument, or do you have the same objections to the argument as you did in the previous conversation?
Yes, of course, the objections are going to remain similar, but I just want to see the argument once again. And then finally speaking, I just want extra clarity real quick. What do you mean by maximum causal power? What does that mean there?
Maximal causal power? Meaning that
Yeah.
that's causal sovereignty. Do you know what that means in the literature when you talk about causal sovereignty?
I'm not sure what you mean, though.
Okay, so causal sovereignty, when you're talking about that in the context of theism, is just to say that you have a given object which has causal power or causal control over all things which exist, such that it would be the case that nothing in the universe could have existed without this object actually existing.
And the universe means to say what exactly?
Universe is just referring to all things which are being caused by a particular thing.
Okay,
So
so what
universe
is
is
the
not going to be
argument for
used
God's
in the sense of
existence?
spatial temporality. What's up?
Yeah,
Go
I
for
just
it.
wanted to clarify that. Yeah, 100%. But what was the argument?
Got you. I'm going to post the arguments right now, actually. Give me a sec.
Okay.
It's going to be the scans chat, by the way, just to be clear.
Okay. Let me know when you post it, man.
So check the scans chat. This argument, or the layout of this argument, by the way, is a little bit, it's the same as the original argument in the previous conversation. However, there are certain terminologies which I'll fix currently, but I don't care to fix it right now. So if you're going to ask me clarifying questions, I'll do such and explicate on what the points actually are within the argument. Got you?
Yeah, for extra clarity, are you fine if I just use the original argument that you sent as if I go back to the argument and just look at that argument?
Absolutely, it's the same argument. That's what I did a while ago,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Yeah. All right, hold on. Hey, by the way, Nani, I'm on my PC and I accidentally moved some of the channels. So could you please fix that?
Yeah, wait. Let me get back to my computer.
Does anybody have the original message that he sent the argument for? Or the original message that he sent the argument in? Let me see. Yep.
Pretty sure you just sent it right
I mean,
now.
he sent it. No, I'm not talking about that version. But yeah, he sent it against Plutus as well. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, then.
Yo, did Punish
Pretty
Deadass
sure,
just send me to? Oh my god,
pretty sure it's this one. Don't just one of Tunes games.
yo. Yo, never mind, Herbie. Just go back on mute, bro.
That's very funny. I'm not gonna comment on that. I mean, he did just say he want the one he sent against Plutus, which that is the one he sent against Plutus.
Let's see.
It's this one, man. This is the one.
Yes,
he sent
perfect.
against
Thank you so much, Oshi. Thank you. Okay.
Holy fuck! I'm gonna.
Okay. P1.
I'm gonna remember that.
Huh? Do. I agree with P1 with my own deliberation. Okay, what's the argument for P6?
The argument for P6 is going to be the same thing as before, basically. I'm going to recap the argument. So the argument is basically, so granting that, or stipulating, of course, that you grant the first premise, of course, and the previous premises, and we can lead into P6, which is what you're actually contending currently. Just to read for the recording again, make this explicitly clear for anyone who failed to track the argument or understand the argument previously. So P6 states, it is logically impossible and thus necessarily false that God exists as a mere concept. The reason that's why that is the case is because, as I've established previously, what God is a being of maximal causal power. That logically entails being the first cause. If you exist as a mere concept, that's it's just to say that you're identical to a concept. If you're identical to a concept, that means you are a concept, right? So, primarily, the idea is, if you are a concept, right, that means you are a feature of the mind, you're dependent on minds, and so you're caused by minds, necessarily.
Yeah, so just to clarify, that consideration when it comes to the reductive domain is true if and only if there exists metaphysical and logical laws in which employs the opponent first cause existence. I'm not sure if that's true though, so I'm going to need the argument for that.
Why is it the case that the proposition that I mentioned a while ago requires the existence of metaphysical and logical laws?
Because logical codification is what employs the potency within the actual world when it comes to these concrete beings. If it's the case that the
When you say
actual
logical
world doesn't have,
codification, what do you mean by that?
please stop. Please stop. Can you please mute him? I'm not sure
Logical
we're already interrupting
codification.
people. Can you please mute him? Thank you. So codification, if you separate the terms, codification is talking about the systematic evaluation of some variables X, Y, and Z. And then logical, if we put that as a prefix, is going to talk about the evaluation under some logical system. So you can talk about the three laws of thought. The metaphysical modal scope is simply going to be talking about and referring to the compatibility or incompatibility of some nature, or in other words, some essence. If we ascribe it to some object X, so it follows that obviously there needs to exist some logical or metaphysical law in which employs the potency of a concrete being when it comes to establishing the first cause, which I'm not sure if that's true, so I need the argument for that. Additionally speaking, I'm not sure if you heard this original contention, but I don't grant P1 past my deliberation, meaning to say that I'm not sure if I grant P1 in the way that you mean, but rather I grant P1 in the way that I mean.
Okay, so just a couple of things, right? So you talk about logical codification, which is going to be meaning that, well, codification in this given context is the systematical evaluation of variables. Well, understand that given that definition, when you're talking about variables in the context of debating in philosophy or logic, you're talking specifically about like alphabets which are utilized in formal language. You dumb fuck, this is not even a formal language argument, this is a natural language argument. So by definition, your whole question was gibberish because you can't even apply to the freaking arguments. The argument is in natural language, meaning that when you're going to be talking about logical codification and whether or not this thing would exist for it to be the case that premise 6 would be correct, that would be irrelevant to premise 6 because premise 6 again is going to be something which is expressed in natural language. There's no variables which is expressed in the goddamn argument. And so if your question hinges on there being variables in the goddamn argument or there being some sort of formal language to begin with, then the question commits to category error number 1. Number 2 is simply, you said that you're not sure if you grant premise 1 given what I mean by premise 1, but you grant what premise 1 is given what you mean by premise 1. But in our previous conversation, as you've said explicitly, you grant the idea that it is the case that semantical conditions or conceptual conditions would in fact exist, which is what I mean by informational model principle of meta-ontology in the given conversation. So we have the same definition, and so given that particular agreement that you have signed off in the previous conversation, unless you want to retract that given position, it would in fact be the case, trivially speaking of course, that logical and metaphysical laws do in fact exist, even though that's irrelevant to the Gotham argument, but you want to go off into a derailed one because you're a derailed donkey, you want to go off into derailed detours, and that's fine. Right, so do you have any other trash objections to the argument, Halfwit?
Look, so we have to bring forth the Gemini AI Pro fucking responses because he realized that he couldn't beat me argumentatively. He started appealing to the rhetoric, which is what he did against everybody that he loses to argumentatively speaking. Just to clarify, because he's really retarded and can't track basic points. I already told you what I meant to say by variables. So it's the case that I'm not talking about something which is formal. I'm talking about natural language. We're both sharing that type of domain. I'm not sure why you tried to bring that up and act as if that was a response to what I said originally speaking, although that just did not address anything. Just to clarify, I already gave some description of a variable within the case of codification. You obviously didn't address it or attack it because you can't fucking track. So I'm not going to repeat it and help you because I'm not here for daycare. I'm not the owner of some daycare in which guides the hand of retards and childish fucking behavior, like, for example, Apollo. In response to the second point, which is commenting on how I agreed to P1 with my own deliberation, but not your deliberation. However, in the prior recording, at least when it comes to our debate, you believe I conceded to that position. No, that's the reason why you lost, Apollo. It's because you still hold the belief that I conceded to that shitty ass position. That's not true at all. I agree to meaningful reductive domains. I just don't agree to reductive domains overall, semantically speaking, when it comes to assessing someone's existence or evaluating whether or not someone exists. The idiosyncrasy, at least relative to the first point that I just brought forth, is something which was already clarified. It's the case that I'm not talking about some philosophical standard, but rather some natural language type of tone. So I'm not sure why that's going to be a response. And finally, the analyticity as a response to my comment on the deliberation that I possess for P1 is going to be something which is not justification towards the both, I apologize, justification towards the metaphysical and logical laws, but rather that's going to be something which is a non sequitur regarding the first point. Because I'm not sure if you understand what I mean to say by logical and metaphysical laws when I'm employing it into this conversation. So please put the goggles on. And yes, I'm stealing this from you because it's very, very ironic. Please put the tracking goggles on and do not make me hold your hand through the rest of this conversation because so far it seems as if you're getting fucking embarrassed, you retard.
So, my little son, my little seed, I want you to walk with me here, okay? I want you to lock the fucking right. So, first and foremost, I want to just laugh at this really comical aspect of the conversation, right? So, you basically started off by using the Google Gemini insult you got from me, by the way, and started over that comeback, which is actually really hilarious. And the most hilarious part of this is how you recycle lines you stole from your rhetorical godfathers, like me, for example, and then try to reuse that in the conversation to get rhetorical dominance. Get them rhetorically blown the fuck out and walked over this conversation. Stop piece and record, it's complete garbage, just to be clear on that part. Now, if you want to talk about the other stuff regarding the substance part, you talked about how it is the case, apparently, that I could perhaps have a different understanding of what you mean by semantical or conceptual conditions, and then you actually derailed from that point in the matter of a couple of like 3 seconds, I guess, into another point about justification. I'm not saying specifically that it is justification for the premise 1 that we're talking about here, or premise 2 rather, which are one of the premises you're attacking, which is premise 1 in this given context. But I'm telling you here simply that if you're saying that you agree, and I repeat, I'm going to speak slowly because you're actually a fucking retard, right? If you're saying here that you agree, and I repeat, you agree on premise 1 being correct, given your deliberation, given what you mean by the terminologies which are utilized in premise 1, and I'm explaining and I explicated as to why premise 1 actually agrees upon, or rather, your semantics of the terminologies in premise 1 is the exact same as my semantics of the terminologies in premise 1, then it would in fact be the case that there's no justification required for premise 1 because you automatically concede it's premise 1, given the fact you agreed on premise 1 being the case, given your semantical landscape, which is quite literally identical to my semantical landscape. You need to track the conversation really and truly. Now, to get back to the other part of what we're talking about, so premise 1, you've conceded to premise 1, you've opened your legs to premise 1 because you're my bitch, of course, and basically to move on to another point of the conversation, right, you are not even attacking the idea of the logical contradiction part. You weren't even able to even attack and point out how you misused a terminology such as logical codification to sound smart because you thought you're Jimmy Neutron. You thought you're that guy, but you're not that guy. You're freaking my bitch right now. So I'm telling you specifically that you try to use that terminology, right? And then afterwards, after exposed how you're using jargons, you're just jargon maxing and retard maxing into conversation, right? You then retracted that point, or rather derailed from the point, right? So in this given conversation, you can't be saying logical laws in the given context of codification if it is the case that You're indexing codification to variable usages when there's no variable usages in the goddamn argument. You're just jargon maxing, as I've said previously, to paint yourself as a smart person, even though you're a complete dumb fuck. Now, last but not least, or hopefully this is the last point I should say, right? The logical laws or metaphysical laws, you've not demonstrated why it would be the case that premise 6 being correct hinges or supervenes on these things that they're talking about even existing. You've not demonstrated or corroborated that to be the case, number one. Number two is simply, my response to that specific point is me pointing out that it would be analytically true for it to be the case, given the definition of what God is, which you've not contended, which you've not rebutted, which you've not actually contradicted, right? And given the fact that the definition of God, which entails the analytic fact of God being the first cause, given what I've assessed the first cause, the maximal causal part to be incompatible with God being a concept. So are we going to keep on dodging from the actual point and going on to these conversational detours to retard max the entire time, or are we going to finally attack the argument and not do a job as poorly as your previous freaking performance and got blown the fuck out and walked over in their previous conversation? Pick a struggle, retard.
Yeah, so ignoring the fact that you sound like Plutus with the random pauses that you understand that you can address the argument within. Just to clarify, I've been using that ChatGPT line before you were even in the fucking community, as in before you returned back from your little break after getting destroyed from fucking goons. Now, as a response to the first thing, just to clarify when it comes to the metaphysical compatibility and consideration thesis I was referring to, let's just clarify for everybody in the VC. And yes, I want to emphasize this. Clarify, clarify, clarify. That is the truth maker for reality, you fucking retard. How we determine something being potent within reality, it's off of its compatibility with facts of reality, or in other words, systems of reality. If it follows that there isn't any system of reality in which employs the potency of some given object X, it follows that the given object X does not have any potency. That's tautologically the case. So there exists some analyticity when it comes to assessing whether or not something is possible, and then the possibility is going to be in respect to some reductive domain, at least modally speaking. So it follows that some biological modal scope, some neurological modal scope, some epistemological modal scope are all going to be governed by some logical and metaphysical modal scope, because we're trying to assess some reductive domain, at least restriction wise, to say why something is impossible. So the reason why something is impossible biologically speaking is because there's some fact about our biological system in which does not employ the potency. Obviously, meaning that obviously a metaphysical governance exists. And when it comes to the codification, there's nothing within the Oxford Dictionary definition of codification in which talks about variables. I added variables so I can add clarity towards the response to your shitty ass fucking argument, okay? So the variables are simply just representing concrete objects. You can switch the variables out with anything. That's why it's X, Y, and Z. Like I said, you can switch the variables out with anything. You didn't respond to anything. That's not how logical codification is used. And even if that were to be how it's used, I already cleared up the idiosyncratic view that I was quote unquote taking if I were to grant that your point is true. Now, when it comes to the restrictive landscape, yes, I agree. My landscape, when it comes to the liberation of P1, has a restrictive comprehensive category. Yeah, that's the point of my objection towards P1. I don't grant P1. My semantics is not at all infer that I grant P1, but rather it's the case that given my deliberation, I'm fine with P1. But guess what, Apollo? The point of me obviously making that clear is due to the fact that my deliberation is most likely something which is incompatible with your deliberation of P1. You fucking retard. So I need justification for P1 rather than it just be being talked about or referring to semantic reductions in which are actually meaningful. That's what I need the justification for, okay? Now, what you need to do so far is explain why, or at least what you need to do currently is explain why P6 is true, given some incompatibility with a metaphysical law or logical law, because all you've done is go circular. So just to clarify, when it comes to your argument regarding the conceptual schema, at least how the definition is going to be incompatible with the conceptual schema, because if it's a first cause, obviously things can be caused mentally, subject, whatever. It's the case that there needs to be something in which employs that being potent within reality. It follows that that argument is only true if there exists comprehensive unrestriction. I apologize. Unrestrictions, but I don't grant that there exists unrestrictions. That's the point of contention. You're begging the question, Apollo. This is what you do in all your fucking debates. You need to justify that there is no contradiction in there being a first cause, for example. There is no contradiction when it comes to some metaphysical system of codification, logical system of codification, or anything of the sort. That is the point. What you're doing is gibberating on meta points because you realize that you cannot argumentatively win. That's all you fucking do, okay? So the justification as to why the metaphysical laws are what makes reality, I apologize, what assesses or determines facts within reality is analytically true. Obviously, it's the case that for things to exist within reality, they have to have some rule or principle in which employs their existence. alongside that, there has to be some rule or principle in which employs the potent existence as well, because obviously the actual world has to have the background foundation of possibility, or in other words, potency. So I'm not sure why you questioned that. That seems to be a blunder. I don't think you really understood that point. I'm going to really hope that you didn't understand that point, because if you did, it just makes it look worse for you. So currently speaking, we need justification for P1, P2, and P6. Apollo, let's see how you're going to respond to the points and adequately justify your position. Because as so far, you've done none of that, cornball ass nigga.
First and foremost, you try to be rhetorical, and you're just embarrassed and studying over your words, which is really hilarious to me. Secondly, you need to actually log in. You claim that purely I should put my checking dogs on, but you don't even have your checking dogs on. You've forgotten it completely, right? So just to defend a couple of things, right? So you asked me specifically, or
Well, I
rather,
don't mean
you
to cut
said
you off, but you're cutting out.
metaphysical laws. You're interrupting one more time. You're interrupting
You're
right
cutting
now.
out. You're cutting out. You're cutting out.
Oh, really? Is anyone saying that I'm cutting out, or can anyone agree that I'm cutting out or no?
Your background noise is cutting
Nope.
you out, but yeah, look at chat.
Your mic was like
Yeah, I'm not
slowly.
cutting out, dude. So anyways, to continue my point.
Everybody is saying in chat that you're cutting out. Like, I don't know why you think everything is trying to be rhetorical, my nigga. Like, you're so insecure about your rhetoric.
All right,
The
chill,
people
chill.
who are actually on in front of
You're
the
all
screen
saying that you're cutting out. Like, you're so insecure, Apollo. It's bad.
All right, chill,
You're the only
insecure, says the guy who's like
fire
banning
emoji
people
that
from the
you're looking
server
at.
continuously
Oh my
because he
God.
said
Oh
that they
my
lost
God.
the conversation.
Listen,
That's
yo,
actually
Apollo.
I'm not
crazy.
sure what you said there.
Listen, I'm gonna mute Infinity. Listen, Apollo.
I'm not sure
Don't
about
stop.
anything,
Go back to
retard.
that. Listen, stop. Go, bro. Just go back in the point, bro. Just go back in the point, bro.
Okay, so Hermes, am I audible? Yes or no?
The audible now. Just go ahead, bro.
Okay, gotcha, cool. So, kind of like funny how you tried to grandstand by saying I'm insecure after you banned people from the server because they disagreed with him winning the conversation we had previously. That's just like a funny side comment I'm going to make for the time being. Now, to mention the other part, he talked about how it is the case that metaphysical laws will be the truth makers of propositions. I'm not sure what that background noise even is. Was it Infinity? Was that Slave Monkey or something? Someone put the Muslim in, please, and thank you. Just in case. So he said specifically that metaphysical laws are the truth makers of propositions, and then in the midst of explaining as to why that would be the case, he derailed, as if he forgot the point he made, into talking about them being the things which determines possibilities. You retard. There's a radical difference between something being the truth makers of propositions and something being the type of thing which is a necessary condition for something to be a possibility or for this to be correct modal claims. You can have non-modal claims, for example, which are not indexed to a modal scope, and it would in fact be the case that such thing would, of course, on your perspective, not be something which is a truth maker. So if you're going to be telling me here that metaphysical laws are truth makers for propositions, in virtue of the fact that they are relevant to, for example, determining possibilities, and then you went on to a derail tangent listing different types of modal scopes which your fish brain don't even understand, you're just literally just doing a bad job on the optics right now, and on the substance, and on the overall argumentation. So again, that's just the first thing. Secondly, you stated specifically that it is the case that you're placing into question, or you're skeptical rather, of the existence or the ontological or metaphysical profile of these laws which you believe have to exist for premise 6 to be true. After I've schooled you and gave you a free seminar on logic and metaphysics and explained it to you like a slow boy as to why it would in fact be the case that premise 6 does not hinge on the specific thing you're talking about or presuppose it, right? So it doesn't hinge on them existing, but even if it did, you've already indirectly conceded them existing, because your position, which you've agreed on, which you've not even contended, is specifically you agree that with semantical or conceptual conditions exist. Logical and metaphysical laws have semantical and conceptual conditions, even given your own position, because you gave a definition of logical laws, you tried to break it down into codification, you got stepped on, you got walked all over that given point, and then you give a definition of metaphysical laws, and you explicated on what that thing actually is. So these things have conceptual and semantical conditions. You agreed, and I repeat, you basically agreed on this. You agreed and signed off on the proposition that with semantical or conceptual conditions do in fact exist. So you automatically conceded to the very same thing you're skeptical of, you dumb, retard, scumbag, loser, dork debater, which is simply you having to agree now the same thing you're placing into question, i.e. logical laws and metaphysical laws respectively, would exist given your own meta-ontology and given my meta-ontology, which you conceded on in the previous conversation and also in this current conversation. So you've cooked your own point after trying to be skeptical of the very same thing you agreed on, but of course you forgot you agreed on this because you're extremely retarded. You're like intellectually deficient as fuck, right? It's actually really embarrassing, right? So that's just to attack that point, really. So I've demolished and dispatched and eliminated that sort of like garbage dog piss point out of the conversation. So I want to laser focus on just basically the rest of the parts really. So you can see that the premise one being the case, is going to be confined to your deliberation, your assessment, your inept assessment of what premise one is, which coincidentally is identical to my assessment of the terminology. So you agree on premise one, you concede to premise one, you concede to my meta-ontology, and most importantly, given my meta-ontology, the same things you're placing into questions to even exist would actually exist. And so, last but not least, hopefully, it is the case that I've explicated as to why it would in fact be true that God would exist objectively, given the definition of God that you've also signed off on like a retard. So, do you have any other objections, retard? Yes or no? Stop wasting our goddamn time, retard.
So look, the reason why there's so much repetition in his speech, and make sure that he's actually server muted because he likes to interrupt whenever he realizes that he's getting stumped on. The reason why there's so much repetition within his speech is because he realizes how non-rhetorical he is. Nobody actually finds him appealing. Not a single person in this VC is willing to vote on him if there were to be a poll created, other than himself and his shitty ass goons, of course. Now, he commented on me stuttering, although there exists multiple stutters throughout that gibberation fest that everybody in chat, by the way, is saying was a yacht session. When it comes to me banning people because they disagree with me, yes, I ban a lot of people who disagree with me. Yeah. I didn't ban anybody because they said that I lost to you. Like, I obviously don't give a fuck about Free to Go and his opinion regarding our debate. I'm not sure why you tried to bring that up. And just to clarify, I'm saying it's both the metaphysical and logical law. It's not just about the logical codification. Both of those types of systems are going to codify the potency. I believe that both of them are always going to be interchangeable when it comes to at least their governance towards some situation. So it's the case that in every single situation where you see some logical codification, there has to exist some metaphysical codification and vice versa. When a modal claims not being indexed to the modal scope or not being indexed to a modal scope, or how they're not always going to be indexed to a modal scope, I'm referring to what allows for compatible concrete objects, you fucking retard. So whenever you say that I concede to P1, therefore in virtue of that concession, it has to be a case that I grant that these principles exist. It's not about the principles existing, for one, and two, I never at all highlighted a concession to P1. I don't grant P1. I don't think you're understanding that. I don't grant your P1. I don't grant what you mean by P1. What that means to say is that I don't grant that P1 under your view is true, Apollo. How many times do I have to repeat that claim and stump it into your fucking head, you fucking retard, okay? Now, just to clarify, I'm talking about foundationalist principles. So obviously, that's why I brought up the actual world potency relationship. For the actual world to exist, there has to be some potency foundation behind it, or else it's the case that the actual world wouldn't exist. That's obviously true. If it's impossible for the actual world to exist, then it cannot exist. That's tautologically true. Dumbass retard. You tried to school me on analyticity in our prior conversation, but it seems as if you're not even tracking the analyticity point currently speaking. So please, please, please use your ear. And at least finally, in respect to that specific point, whenever you comment on how I tried to give justification as to why nature is the truth maker for all these propositions, but I derailed into a different point. And no, the reason why you believe I derailed into a different point is because goons destroyed you so hard that your brain doesn't fucking work. You're actually autistic. Nobody derailed into a different point. It's obviously the case that, and I can just give an analogical argument. Let's say, necessarily speaking, this is just an example, at least starting off the analogical argument. Let's say, necessarily speaking, for you to walk, it has to be the case that you possess legs. That means that possessing legs, which is a part of your essence, is going to be the feature in which makes the proposition you can walk true, you dumbass bitch. So it's obviously foundationalist principles. I'm not talking about the employment of the truth condition specifically, but rather what guides the truth condition. And then just to clarify, yes, it follows that metaphysical and logical codification is also going to be the truth maker, because things in which are not logically possible cannot exist in reality. Things in which are logically possible employ laws in which allows for propositions to correspond with reality. And then secondly speaking, it follows that these systems in which exist, which are going to be metaphysically based, because obviously they're a part of your essence, is what employs the truth, in which is a description towards a correspondence perspective, you fucking retard. So let's say, for example, you have a wall. You can say that the proposition you have a wall is true because the essence of the wall is identical with the essence of the wall, which is obviously true. That's trivial. Yes, it follows that some metaphysical system is what governs the truth makers of reality. Yes, we can say that a wall exists because there exists some rule in which employs the wall existing, the rule being the existence of the essence specifically. So whenever you talk about how the principles are going to have to exist given my concession to P1, which doesn't exist, by the way, it has to be the case that the concession of P1 entails that the laws exist independent of the mind. But if you were to say that, that just goes circular, because you're going to want to say that P6 is true in virtue of these laws in which exist, but the laws in which exist have to be independent, but the laws in which exist in and which are independent have to be true given their definition. But that all goes circular because I'm questioning whether or not the definition is compatible with the state of affairs within reality within the first place. So all you did was question bag. I teach you this every single time we debate. It's a question bag. It's a question bag. It's a question bag. You have to actually watch my debates, Apollo, and you'll realize how not to question bag. It's very, very simple, my nigga. Give a premise, give another premise, give a conclusion, and justify the premises in which they're inferential towards the conclusion without relying on one of the premises. It's simple as that, Apollo. Yay! We learned this in 5th grade. This is called a logical fallacy, Apollo. Your entire point is fallacious. So far, all you've done is concede to my positions, consequentially speaking, without you acknowledging your concession, comment on how I conceded because you can't fucking track, and finally speaking, you fail to acknowledge how there has to be an employment within reality when it comes to the metaphysical and logical codification in a way in which allows them to truth track what you're saying P6 was, okay? So, your main objective, currently speaking, Apollo, and I want you to hyper focus on this because obviously I need to guide you and hold your hand, like it is the daycare that I mentioned originally speaking. Your main focus is to justify P6 in a way in which does not go circular. Because if you just use the existence, due to the semantic reduction, if you just use this existence of the metaphysical and logical principles, it's the case that you're going to want to say that they exist in virtue, all right, but just they exist objectively, at least as concrete objects in virtue of their description or definition, considering that it's impossible due to the incompatibility of them being concepts. But then I go circular because what instantiates the incompatibility?
Okay, now that he's finished, so the black suburban unwanted ape just projected the entire time. So what he would do is he'd realize he's not tracking, he'd realize he's not even responding to the argument, he'd realize that he's committing logical fallacies, and then everything that he's doing, which he's fucking up on currently, he projects it onto the conversation by saying, no, you, like really creative rhetoric, guys. And also, you started off your little tangent and diatribe by saying, but people in the server, they don't think you're winning, they think you're, yeah, it's almost a shocker. It's like such a shocker that people in the server which don't like Apollo, right, don't believe Apollo is winning. Like, who would have expected that, genius? Now, to get to the actual substance here, you talk about how if it is to be the case that something is metaphysically possible, then it would be the case that such thing would not be existent, and so it would not be a true proposition. You absolute retard, you scumbag loser who has never read anything on philosophy and logic. There's a difference between something being a prerequisite, and by prerequisite, just to clarify for you, because you have the vocabulary of a 3rd grader and you're retarded, right? By prerequisite, I'm talking about a necessary condition, right? So just because a necessary condition for something to exist is going to be, in the case of course, that it is not metaphysically impossible, then it doesn't follow from it being a necessary condition for something to exist that it is not metaphysically impossible, that it would be the case that that same condition would cross over to truth theory, right? So you're conflating ontology with truth theory, which is just a rudimentary low-level error from a low-level debater of your level, of course, because you're extremely autistic and you're extremely inept and you're extremely lacking in critical and social and reasoning skills, of course, right? So just a second, I wanted to lock in the conversation right now, right? I'm telling you specifically that as it pertains to what you're saying here, all you're establishing in the conversation is simply that this thing is relevant and necessary for something to exist. But existence is different from talking about truth valuations, right? You can have propositions under some given ontology which are true, even if it is the case that there's no onto commitment in that proposition, of course, right? So you're conflating two entirely different philosophical fields and then making a non sequitur type extrapolation from one field over to the for the huge leap in logic in the conversation. I want to get that really explicitly clear. Now, you said that you don't agree with my understanding of P1. So I have a question for you, which I know and I predict you're going to dodge. What's my understanding of premise 1? And prove to me that my understanding of premise 1 is something which you don't agree on, given your assessment of what my understanding of premise 1 is, which I doubt even understand because you are extremely autistic, again, as I've said previously, right? So prove to me that premise 1, or my understanding of premise 1 and the concepts embedded in that, is not mapping on to your concept, and explain to us, explain for not just me, but for the audience as to what the assessment or what my assessment of premise 1 is. So that's your burden that you're gonna have. You talk about me having to watch your debates, dude. I'll never watch any of your debates to learn anything, except if my goal is to be a tier 7 retard who struggles to understand basic concepts, rudimentary concepts, and struggles to articulate basic arguments and even give good arguments and sound arguments and valid arguments. That's gonna be the only reason I'll be watching your debates, to become worse, not to become better, because you are garbage. You're the epitome of garbage. So I want you to lock in, as you claim, put your tracking goggles on. Yeah, Infinity, Sunny Boy, lock in, put your tracking goggles on. And as I would always tell you, like I've told you previously, focus on that dialectical GPS, Sunny Boy, and lock in. Respond to the goddamn points and stop gibbering like a retard who schizomaxing the entire time and fighting the demons in his head currently. Respond to the goddamn points, dumb fuck. Go for it.
Yeah, so the only reason why you added that little gibberation in at the end is because you realized that you can't attack me in any other way. Just to clarify, and I really love this word called clarification because it's something that you lack. Your speech is so terrible to the point where all of your points are vague and I'm still able to address them. No. No, 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 no. It's impossible for you to watch my debates with the mere goal of becoming worse, considering that you're at the bottom of the fucking tier list. You're up there with Free to Goat. Tier 50 is something that you cannot surpass in terms of becoming worse. So no, I'm not sure why you tried to bring that up at all. Well, actually, I am sure it's because you realized that you had no actual response. Now, because you cannot track, I would like to extra clarification. I would like to add extra clarification towards the metaphysical distinction. There exists a metaphysical principle in which employs the potency, and there exists a metaphysical principle in which employs the existence of some object Y. And then obviously truth is going to describe the existence of these states of affairs. That's what I mean to say whenever I talk about truth. Truth is what corresponds to reality, meaning that the word truth is going to obviously describe things which are states of affairs within reality. Something is true if and only if it exists within reality. Therefore, obviously, the metaphysical principles that I'm talking about are going to be distinct in terms of employment, but the employment is what you're failing to address, retard. So whenever you talk about how there obviously exists some categorical distinction, at least when it comes to the metaphysical modal scope relative to the truth theory, I don't think you're understanding that point. Saying that there exists a red herring or some non sequitur point does not actually mean that there exists a red herring or some non sequitur point. That's just you projecting your retardation onto the debate because obviously it cannot fit within your head. It's so fucking large in response to everything else. When it comes to the necessary condition, obviously the necessary condition is something which is still applicable within this context. It follows that even if I were to grant your point when it comes to the necessary condition of the metaphysical principle and the logical principle, obviously if it doesn't employ any potency, then it cannot be the case that your point is true, that being P6. And the distinction that both of us have, by the way, just to clarify, love the word clarification, for everybody in the VC, including the recording, you fucking bias ass retard Gyro. Yes, Gyro, you fucking shitty ass debater Gyro. When it comes to deliberation of P1, at least on my end, even if there exists some failed deliberation of P1, does that mean that P1 is true? At least failed deliberation on my end. Does that mean that P1 is true? That P2 is true? That conclusion 1 is true? No, no, it does not, which is why he's avoiding justifying his burden. But look, as clarity, the distinction, at least when it comes to our deliberation of P1, which you've yet to give your deliberation, by the way, I never said you gave deliberation. The distinction in our deliberation, or in other words, our views when it comes to P1, is going to be the restricted versus unrestricted lens. So it's the case that for P1, you're taking an unrestricted lens when it comes to semantical reduction. Well, I'm taking a restricted lens to talk about meaningful reductive domains, which you have yet to address, you fucking retard. This is something that I already clarified. This was something mentioned earlier within the debate. So please stop using that shitty ass GPS line because unlike you, I don't need a map of the conversation because my head can track everything that is going on. It's not hard at all to track these third grader points that you're making, which is why I keep on mentioning how this is daycare because I have to hold your hand and change your diapers, Apollo. So ignoring the argumentative fucking shit that you took in your diaper, please, I'm begging you, Apollo, either respond to the points or conclude.
Paulie, you're unmuted.
Yeah, so the retard said a whole bunch of gibberish, right? So let's just focus on the first thing, which is non-gibberish. So he stated specifically that his definition of truth is what corresponds to reality. So given the fact his definition of what is true, or what truth is that which corresponds to reality, he would automatically have to concede to my position now, which is that God exists objectively, because guess what? My mind is within reality, and within my mind is a set of beliefs, one of the beliefs being that God exists objectively. And so because they're the proposition proposition, which is that God exists objectively, which corresponds to that belief, which is within my mind, which is a part of reality, that given its own definition of what truth is, it would be the case the sentence God exists objectively would be a true proposition, because all it means for a proposition to be true is, of course, for it to correspond to some given thing in reality. And the sentence God exists objectively, that proposition, it corresponds to something within reality, which is my beliefs, you dumb fuck. So you just conceded to your own position, or rather, to my own position, which is that God exists objectively, given your own assessment of what truth even is. So that's blunder number 1, or actually blunder number 8, sorry. That's a huge miscount. Wow, that's crazy. So your own assessment of what truth is indirectly concedes, or makes it the case that you'd have to concede that God exists objectively, which is my position of this conversation. So that's basically an open concession, basically. So, to address the other part, you talked about how it is the case that if you had failed deliberations, etc., a whole bunch of jibber jabber, it would not make it the case that the premises, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, going down respectively, would be true. I have never, in this conversation, ever said that this would make it true, you idiot. However, in debates, which you don't even understand how debates work because you are an actual retard, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, you're like genuinely retarded. It's actually crazy, right? So, in debates, right, you have a thing called the burden of rejoinder, okay? And in this conversation specifically, or in any debate conversation, primarily, it would be the case that if you fail to respond to a particular position, right, such that you have not placed them into question, nor have you rebutted or contradicted or debunked these claims, then it would in fact be the case that such a position would go through, right, such that it would be the case that I have no burden of proof to prove those claims because they're never placed into question. So if you're not placing into question or attacking any of the premises of the goddamn argument, then you lose by default, you dumb idiot, you absolute moron. So, with that being said, you have not placed into question premise 1 and premise 2. All you said specifically was given your deliberation. Oh, given my deliberation, it would be the case that premise 1 is true and you agreed on premise 1 being true. You said this explicitly on this very same recording. You said that you agreed to premise 1 being true given your own deliberation. Then again, just in the previous conversation, you tried to walk back from that claim, right? Because you realized again that you fucked up completely. And you tried to basically say, oh, I never agreed on premise 1. After you agreed on the premise 1 explicitly, and I pointed out your agreement on premise 1 and the entailments and the consequences of you agreeing on premise 1, which is you getting blown the fuck out of this conversation. So again, that would be the case. You made an affirmative claim, a really audacious claim, rather, a confident claim, that apparently that my deliberation of the terminologies in premise 1 is not identical to your deliberation of the terminologies in premise 1. To which I responded by asking you, what is my deliberation, or what's my assessment when it comes to the terminologies in premise 1. And then the retard, the black retard, responded by saying, there's distinction in deliberation, but I've never given a deliberation. So I want to know, really, I just want to know, because you have the mind of a true scholar, true genius, right? Like Tesla, right? I want to know, how do you know that our deliberation is different without me ever articulating or even implying what the deliberation is that implied the conversation? How do you even understand this? How do you even know what my deliberation is without even understanding, or rather, I should say, without ever hearing me explicate or even articulate what the deliberation is? It makes absolutely no sense to me, right? So you haven't told me what the deliberation is. Actually, you attempted to tell me what my deliberation is. Your response is you saying that your version of premise 1 is restricted and my version is unrestricted. First and foremost, I wanted to prove that claim, and that claim is just obviously incorrect, because my version of talking about existence with respect to semantical and conceptual conditions is restricted, because I've mentioned in this conversation and in the previous conversation that I'm confining these things to be indexed to stuff with logically stable conditions. So I'm restricting it to the domain of logically stable conceptually semantical conditions. So when you attempted to give my deliberation or my assessment of the terminologies baked into premise 1, and then you basically say, in the like the retard you actually are, you said specifically that premise 1 is going to be something which is hinging on a unrestricted version given my assessment, whereas your assessment is restricted. That gets explicitly contradicted by the very fact, of course, that I've just specified what the restriction is, which is simply the condition of it having to be logically stable. So you can have conceptually semantical conditions, and those conditions are contradictory. And given my position, because of the restriction I've basically placed on my meta-ontology, those things would not even exist because they're contradictory. So when you said there's no restriction given my meta-ontology, given my deliberation, given my assessment, that was explicitly incorrect, as proven by my clarification, like you love to talk about a while ago. So that's basically it. You're wrong about the deliberation point. You got blown the fuck out at that point, of course. You got walked over, got stepped on, you got like literally your intestines torn the fuck out because you're just my bitch, of course. On that point, you made a contradictory, or rather, performatively contradictory point by saying that I've never told you what my deliberation is, but my deliberation is different from your deliberation, which I want to know how in the goddamn way you're gonna even understand or even know what my point even is without me even telling you what my point even is. So that's basically it on the deliberation point. About the truth points, really, about you saying truth is what corresponds to reality. I've explained why, given that assessment of truth, trivially it would be the case that my conclusion is true because the proposition, which is expressed by the conclusion of the argument, it corresponds to reality, corresponds to something which exists, which is my belief in my mind. So trivially, that proposition is true, and so you can see that to my conclusion, but also the entire freaking debate. So that's basically on the truth part, and also you just we're completely confused about the distinction between ontology and truth theory. And again, for me to even further educate you these basic rudimentary concepts that you should have known before heading into this debate, whereas you're getting rhetorically beaten the fuck out in, you should have just basically, or rather, for me to even continue educating you on any of these concepts, I should say, you have to pay me for this stuff. Like, this is actually crazy. Like, you don't deserve any more of my lessons on these basic concepts. You would have to pay me from now onwards if you want to learn more about this basic stuff that you should have known. But from here on out, I want to just look back onto this debate. I want you specifically to look back on this trash dog water performance and to learn from this experience and understand, of course, that moving forward, don't head into debates that you're philosophically uneducated in if you expect to perform well in the conversation, which is quite contrary to how your performance is in this current debate, which is absolute dog shit. Now, give a response, retard.
Please mute him. Oh my God. Look, let's please speed this up because I understand you have an E6 session with Cork to get to after this. I'm not a minor. I'm not sure why you're still speaking to me currently because obviously you want to elongate the conversation. But look, as just a response to some really, really bad blunders that you made, when it comes to reality, I already clarified what I was talking about. So it seems as if you can't track. You only pinpointed a specific part of the sentence rather than addressing everything within the sentence. By reality, I was talking about, at least in the lens of an external world, which is evidenced by the fact that I said the states of affairs had to be concrete objects. Obviously, concrete objects are going to talk about external world existing beings. They're going to talk about beings which exist within the external world. So when it comes to the truth reductio point, that's not going to be something which follows, considering that your mind doesn't exist, at least the world, as an objective, concrete object. At least the mental faculties that I cut out.
Yeah, repeat the external world part. You just cut out there.
I cut out during that entire point.
No, just like 1 second.
Yeah. So when it comes to, thank you for warning me about that. Look, when it comes to your mind, at least the things within your minds, like for example, your propositional attitudes, is going to be the case that those don't correspond to reality in the same way as these states of affairs in which are concrete. So the reductio is not going to follow. That's a really, really, really terrible blunder. And I'm not sure why you're on number 8 because I haven't made any blunders in this conversation. While namely, unfortunately, you're going to be at what, blunder number 25, which is very, very, very sad. Whenever you talk about how I'm conflating the truth conditions, or in other words, the correspondence theory or the truth theory of the ontological category, maybe you're retarded. But we're talking about these conditions in which exist. Ontology is going to be talking about existence. We're talking about these conditions in which exist when it comes to guidance of truth. So it's going to be the case that you can use these categories and pair them up together to create some pluralist view or some conjunct view that you can employ into a conversation to explain your views regarding the topic. There's no performative contradiction. When it comes to the states of affairs, I want to clarify once again, they're concrete. I already explained the distinction between our views regarding P1 and P2. And obviously, I'm talking about a relative restriction. So it's the case that your view is less restricted than mine. I'm not saying that it's absolutely unrestricted, which is why you should always ask questions of clarity rather than making yourself look even more retarded and more embarrassed than you already are, currently speaking. By unrestricted, I mean to say it's relatively unrestricted in comparison to mine's. In other words, it doesn't have as much of an expansive landscape. What that means to say is that yours is only talking about logical codification behind it, at least under my view of logical codification, while mine's is restricted to both metaphysical and logical codification. So obviously that's going to be something in which is going to clear up the distinction between our unrestricted versus restricted point that you obviously failed to track. When it comes to the burden of rejoinder, I don't think that you understand how that applies here. You tried to bring it up. That's not going to be a response considering that it was put into question, but you don't believe it's put into question. So let's actually move on from that point. If you don't believe that I put into I put it into question. Let's not talk about that at all. And then just to clarify with the deliberation point, and you believe that I blender because I said there was a distinction between our deliberative analyses of P1, considering that you didn't give your deliberation. Yeah, I'm talking about view and deliberation. You gave your deliberation in the prior conversation we have. I was talking about you not giving your deliberation within this specific conversation. However, I literally said view originally speaking. You're the one who used deliberation, your own personal deliberation. Well, I used my own personal deliberation. I said my personal deliberation. I didn't comment on your own deliberation until you did, I'm pretty sure. But either way, that's kind of irrelevant because there is some deliberation. And I already responded as to why there's going to be a distinction. I'm really trying to tone it down because I realize how difficult it is for you to track when I'm speaking in a way in which makes it harder for a retard to understand, which is why I'm currently speaking in this monotone lens or monotone way. So hopefully you can respond to all the points. Hopefully you wrote down all the points. Please, please, Apollo, concede, bro. Just concede. This is really bad for you. And also, by the way, I'm pretty sure the timer already stopped. I don't know why we're still going. What the hell? But anyways, what you need to do is justify P6, justify P1, and justify P2. Now, you believe that I didn't put into question P1 and P2. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, that as so far in the conversation where you made that claim, you are correct. Well, there's a recording, or at least I believe that you're correct. There's a recording. So let's not talk about that point then. Let's leave that point up to the recording because you can't fucking track. Let's say for the recording, they're going to determine whether or not I put into question P1 and P2, okay? So let's move on from that point. Let's only talk about the points in which I just brought up unless we stop here because the timer already ended and you already agreed that we're going to be going off of a timer.
Yeah, so he clearly it's the case that he's scared from me to respond to the actual points he just made, of course, because he knows for a fact, even though the debate went all over the timer, like far beyond the timer, like a long time ago, he's doing the retard thing, which is running away. So he started off actually, just for the person who was recording the conversation, he started off, by the way, by saying specifically that, well, the reason why I'm toning down is because you're not tracking, so you try to explain why his rhetoric is so dog shit currently, which is actually really insane to me. But about the deliberation point, you hedged specifically, and you can even have the last words on this. You hedged specifically on the deliberation point. You said that I have yet to actually give my account or what my deliberation is in the conversation, and you never specified in this conversation, but you said I've yet to actually give this, right? And then now you're saying that you're just talking specifically about this this conversation after realizing the blunder of committed on that point. That's number one. Number two is you said reality is just objective existence, right? And the truth is going to be confined to just propositions about objective existence. So given that position, the sentence which goes like, your mind is experiencing XYZ feeling would not be something which is true, of course, because you believe that truths are only confined to reality, which is only confined rather to objective existence. So given your own position, there would be no such thing as psychological facts or any facts about the mind, or even the proposition like infinite's mind exists, which I'm currently doubting because of how autistic and retarded he sounds. I'm doubting if he even have any intellectual capacity, right? So even that sentence would be something which cannot be true given your own position, right? So either it is a case you bite the bullet and agree that reality is something which encapsulates both mind dependent and mind independent objects, which in any case entails my position being correct, or you try to say that something like your mind existence is not a true proposition because that's about something which is not objective, which would be another blunder, right? So I want to address that part, or rather just address that part, I should say. Now, to talk about the other stuff with respects to you basically saying that your question premise 2, yeah, we can roll back the clip, of course, the recording is there, basically, of you never questioning premise 2, and of you agreeing to premise 1, giving your own deliberation, and basically you getting my assessment of what premise 1 is completely incorrect, because you stated that I have an unrestricted version of this meta-ontological commitment that I have, and then I immediately debunks that point, to which you've not even responded to yet, by the way, by telling you that the restriction that I placed is going to be confined to the domain of logically stable conditions, and you've yet to respond to them because you've realized you completely fucked up on that point, just like you fucked up on every single point in the conversation previous to that point. So that's basically it, really, and so far as that is concerned. You can have the last words, and then we can just head to conclusions, and that would just basically be it for the conversation.
Wow. By the way, my rhetoric is not terrible. My rhetoric is far better than yours. I just want to point that out. But anyways, back to the fake exaggeration to highlight how retarded you are. Oh my God. Oh my God. Everybody in chat, careless, please, mic up. Careless, please, mic up. I need someone smart to speak to. Oh my God. This nigga just said that a reductio towards my view would be that the sentence, oh, Okay. Look, let me just respond real quick. Yeah, Carlos, did you hear that shitty ass point, bro? Just to clarify, the existence of your mind is going to be objective because there exists some metaphysical and logical law in which employs the guidance for the existence of your mind. You fucking retard. So obviously, the fact that your mind exists is not going to be something which is subjective, but rather the interpersonal experiences specifically are going to be subjective. Not the experiences themselves, as in you having the experiences. Obviously, we can say that there exists some truth in which allows the instantiation for the existence of experiences, but the type of experiences that you're having, the contents of the experiences themselves are typically going to be subjective. So, for example, your qualia, like regarding some experience of a color that you've never experienced before, or your mental attitude towards the proposition this flavor of ice cream is good, those things are going to be subjective. That is just your conceptual schema, though. The mind and the conceptual schema are two different things. So when it comes to the existence of the mind, obviously there exists some truth regarding the existence of the mind. So the mind objectively exists 100%. The mind exists in the external world because obviously the mind is identical to your brain. I take those two things to be identical, and it follows that your brain is a part of your body. Your body exists in the external world. But the external world is not talking about the set. I don't think you understand. The set is the brain. The set itself exists in the external world. But the things contained within the set, which are going to be certain mental faculties, exist within the set. That's tautological. So anything within the set is going to be something in which is mind dependent. Anything outside of the set is going to be something which is mind independent. Or certain things which exist within the set in a particular way are going to be mind dependent. Things in which exist outside the set absolutely must exist mind independently. But retard, what does that mean? The set can't exist in the set. So if the set can't exist in the set, that means that the mind, or in other words, the brain in which is the set, is going to be something which is mind independent. Meaning that the contents, or at least certain contents, particular contents within the set, are going to be the things in which are mind dependent. For example, interconnective experiences that you possess, or qualia that you possess. 100%. The sentence that I possess experiences is not subjective. That is true. It is true. It is a fact of your psychological standard or schema that you possess experiences. There is a world in which employs that metaphysically and logically being true. There exists, I apologize, there is a law or a principle in which employs that being true. Yeah, correct. But that's independent of saying that the concept of your experience or the qualia itself is going to be something in which is subjective. So obviously the reductio is supposed to be under your own theory of truth. It has to be the case that unintuitive claims such as this sentence regarding my experiences is going to be true. But no, that's not a comment that I need to make at all. Or false. That's not a comment that I need to make at all. I could just make the claim that the existence is going to be something which is true of your being, considering that the set doesn't exist within the set. It exists independent of the set. And anything that exists independent of the set necessarily must be mind independent, while anything that exists within the set, specific particulars when it comes to mental faculties, can exist mind dependently. And just to clarify, your hypothesis expects for logical and metaphysical codification, which, by the way, he agreed that this is the last word or the last speaking time. I don't know why he agreed to that. I guess I'm just going to repeat points because I'm not a loser, unlike him. Yes, your hypothesis expects for your hypothesis expects that there exists laws metaphysically or logically in which employs the first cause existence. But I don't grant that. I don't grant that. I don't grant that. I don't grant that. Apollo, I understand that, but I'm saying that you said this was the last word. I just want to clarify. So when it comes to me not, and by the way, he tried to slip this in, a lack of specification does not at all infer that there exists a hedge. A hedge is when you intentionally refine your position to make it easier to defend. Yeah, there's no intentionality when it comes to refining my position. There is no refinement when it comes to my position, or in other words, there's no revision to my position. All I'm doing is specifying because you didn't track and you didn't ask the question, which is the following. Well, what do you mean when you said X? You didn't ask that question, retard. So no, there isn't any hedge, you retard. There was just specification. And by the way, I'm not even sure if what you said regarding what words came out of my mouth is fucking true. I'm just saying hypothetically, if I did say that, it would just be due to a lack of specification, at least as to why you brung up this point. And now you can conclude. I really hope, and before you unmute them, I really hope that you're not going to add any arguments towards your conclusions, which is what all the low tiers do. No logical fallacy has been applied to me currently because you tried to say that I was projecting. No, nothing that I said is fallacious. Nothing that I said was a non sequitur. Nothing that I said was circular. There doesn't exist any burden of rejoinder application when it comes to the point that you tried to apply it to, considering what happened in the conversation prior. And I'm actually going to shout you out real quick. I'm glad that you agreed to move on from that point because I don't really care about it. He said, she said. There exists a recording of which is going to embarrass you. And finally speaking, all these burdens in which you possess currently speaking, in which are requirements for your view, or something that you didn't fulfill. You didn't track anything, okay? So Please, Apollo, be unmuted and give your conclusion. Correspondence theories too, man. There doesn't exist any reductio. Simple as that.
Okay. So, just to give my conclusions for this entire debate, this guy did even worse than our previous debate. Actually, it's even more obvious that he is garbage, and really and truly, the only persons who will ever support him as a debater are just a bunch of retard, IQ diminished, dumb fucks in Cast Black Anime Debate server. Just to go over a couple of things, of course. Right, so first and foremost, he said that he agrees to premise one in the first couple of minutes of this recording, given his own deliberation, failed to distinguish between his deliberation and my deliberation. And by deliberation here, I'm specifically talking about, and both me and Infinitive for clarification, we're talking about our understanding of what the terminologies and premise would actually represent, by the way. I've established on the recording, actually, as to why we agree on the same goddamn thing. Given the fact that he agrees that with semantical and conceptual conditions exist, and I also agree on that, and I've basically pointed out the relations between both points. I've explicated and demonstrated as to why they're identical, conceptually speaking. He, on the contrary, made a very preposterous claim, like, for example, it being the case that they're not identical, like with completely different analyses, and he was unable to justify that because he was unable to even point out what my deliberation was or my assessment of premise one is accurately. And he even said that I have not given a deliberation and tried to retract that point by saying he was just specifically talking about in this conversation, which is another retarded blunder he's made, of course, because he's a low tier, right? So about the restricted thing, when he claimed, and I repeat, when he said specifically that my deliberation or assessment was going under an unrestricted version, I directly debunked that by saying no, because my assessment of something existing, given the fact that semantical and conceptual conditions, would be strictly confined to if it is logically stable conditions, which is a restriction. So he was incorrect on that point. Moving on to another thing. He talks about the truth thing. He says truth is that which corresponds to reality. Of course, reality is that which exists. Right, so if he's agreeing on that specifically, which he is granted on the recording, then it would in fact be the case that even something like minds and mental states would be a part of reality. And so anything which would correspond to these existent items, which would be within the set, which is reality, of course, which is what he's indexing truth towards, if something maps onto that, or rather if a proposition corresponds to that given feature, which meets the criteria of his true theory, then trivially it would be the case that such proposition is true. So he tried to basically say that reality is just objective existence, which is another retarded point, which is not really out of character because it's infinity we're talking about. He is genetically disposed to be retarded, right? So basically, if he's claiming, which I've already mentioned this previously, if he's saying there's someone's recording our background noise, I'm not sure whose background that is. Whose background is that? Anyways, so if he's saying specifically that reality is just objective existence, then he cannot say that things which are mind-dependent even exist or is a part of reality. But of course he grants this, because for to say mind-dependent things exist is for to say that they are part of reality, and that's for to say that mind-dependent things is compatible with the concept of reality, which is currently incompatible with his point, right? So that's basically another blunder he's committed again. Right, and my point is simply, he said that the reason as to why it would not be true is because the thing that it is corresponded with is mind dependence, right? And mind dependence would not be what he's talking about when he's talking about reality. And as I've explicated on previously, that would be incompatible with his own commitment. And I've given an example also, which is not even committed or addressed rather, which is simply the sentence given his own position. The sentence, infinity's mind is experiencing XYZ feeling. That would not be something which would be true under his worldview, because that sentence is directly referring to something which is mind dependent and not mind independent, which he believes is something which is necessary for something to be a true proposition and for it to refer to reality. So sentences like that, which are obviously the case, by the way, which he's experiencing feelings, of course, as a human being, those sentences would not be true, and those sentences would not refer to reality given its own intellectually inept position that he adopted in this debate. So that's another blunder he's committed. His own position on what truth is automatically entails that God existing objectively would be a true proposition, which is the conclusion of my argument. The entirety of the conversation, he has not even addressed the analytic facts part regarding my definition of God. He signed off on it. He's not addressed or debunked or contradicted any of that with any facts or any evidence whatsoever. He just signed off on like a retard. Right? Then after signing off on that, and after explicated on the entailment from the definition and the incompatibility between that object, which is God, of course, which is by definition the first cause, which he agreed on, the incompatibility between that and the concept, right? He has not even addressed the contradiction, which I've explicitly mentioned on the recording and explicitly explained numerous different times on the recording. So that's another reason as to why he lost explicitly. So There are just so many reasons. There are countless amounts of reasons as to why he lost this debate beyond a reasonable doubt. And really, truly, there's just no comeback he can make from this dog shit performance. Like, really, truly, so embarrassing, so pathetic. And God, man, if you're a new debater, just don't be like this guy. Right? Really, truly, this is really terrible. Now, with that being said, I'm done my conclusions. You can give your conclusions.
Yeah, thank you. Please go on mute. You have a lot of background noise. So one with the unrestricted versus please please mute yourself. Thank you. When it comes to the restricted versus unrestricted point, obviously I'm talking about relativity. So it's the case that his point is only restricted to a logical codification point or system. My point is restricted to both a logical codification and metaphysical codification. So that's going to be the justification that he didn't respond to. With the reality, I agree that reality is what there is in terms of everything which exists. However, that's not what truth theory is talking about. I specify with the truth theory that it has to be concrete objects in which the state of affairs are representing. So it follows that they exist in the external reality. There exist two categories of reality, which both me and you grant this. Both you and I grant this. You said there exists obviously a conceptual domain and there exists a concrete object domain. In other words, it's a mind-independent domain. Reality governs both, but you can specify what category of reality you're talking about whenever you're proposing the principles in which employs specific facts or employs specific talks. Within this context, I was employing the external world, or in other words, the mind-independent world, in which you failed to track. You thought I was only talking about reality itself, which wouldn't work because I clarified both after you blundered and before you blundered. Now, Apollo, you know who really represents you? You're the too slimy of debating. You are terrible, Apollo. You're the worst debater I've ever debated in my life. I don't know if the 808s are going off when I'm speaking or something, which causes you to not track any point, you fucking retard. When it comes to the principles are what employs the mental capacities, you fucking retard. And the principles are going to be based upon the mind. But that doesn't mean that they're in the mind. So when it comes to the sentence, infinity is experiencing X, Y, and Z, that proposition is true because of some mind-independent principles. There are facts of reality, or in other words, states of affairs within reality in which employs that being true. There exists an employment relationship in which is mind independent. So although the concepts of the experiences themselves may be something of which are subjective, it's the case that the facts about the mind, which is why we say about, not within. We don't say within. The facts about the mind are true. You idiot. There's a distinction between saying the facts about the mind are true and the facts within the mind are true, which is why particular contents within the mind are subject to be mind dependent, which wouldn't include the mind itself because the set is the mind. The mind and the set are identical when it comes to mental faculties, but it's the case that obviously the set cannot exist within the set, which is mind. The mind itself is something which is not at all subjective. It's the things within the fucking mind, which is why we say dependent on the mind, because obviously the particulars are dependent on the set. We're talking about some comprehensive fucking set, you retard. It's basic logic, basic set theory, my nigga. We're talking about a comprehensive restrictive set. So it follows that obviously the particulars are going to create the set. The set is creation of the particulars. In other words, in every single scenario where there's a set, there has to be a particular. In every single scenario where there exists a particular, there has to be a set. So it follows that within a situation, since there exists the employment of mental capacity or the employment of mental faculties, it follows that there exists a set. Obviously, when we say there exist facts about the set, that's distinct from saying that there exist facts within the set. The conceptual schema is going to be what holds the mental attitude towards the propositions of given facts, alongside the experiences that you have. But if the experiences are merely subjective in terms of, like, for example, you didn't respond to this at all because I did respond to your shitty analogy. If the experiences are solely in respective to things such as, and this is just an example, things such as this ice cream flavor is really good. That's distinct from saying that it is true that you experience something in which allows you to make that claim. You fucking retard. So obviously the claim is going to be subjective because it's mind dependent, at least when it comes to your experience of the goodness of the ice cream flavor. However, we can still say that there is a fact about the mind, that being that there exists an employment of an experience in which caused you to have the mental attitude that the ice cream flavor is really fucking good. You are really ass. This blunder is so crazy. Finally, I would just like to clarify. The brain and the mind are identical. You didn't respond to that. You too slimy, shitty ass fucking debater. Okay? So it is the case that the brain instantiates all these experiences. You already have, Okay. Yeah. You know what? Careless. I don't even need to say anything else. That's my conclusion. This nigga is so ass. Okay, who recorded? Oshi, you recorded. Could you please stop the recording and send it? Hey, Apollo, man. Hey, Apollo, I really
left.
appreciate that debate, man. That was a good debate, man.
He's
I
not in
think
the
Too
room.
Slimy makes